Welcome to Tales That Terrify, the podcast that turns your deepest fears into chilling reality. Every week, we bring you fresh, unsettling stories designed to haunt your imagination. From whispers in the dark to the horrors just beyond your sight, these tales will leave you questioning what lurks in the shadows. Want more nightmares? Dare to explore our YouTube channel for even more spine-tingling stories. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and prepare for this week's descent into terror. The sun was setting behind the jagged peaks of the Whispering Pines National Forest, casting long shadows across the trail. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that bites at your cheeks and makes your breath visible in the fading light. I tightened the straps on my backpack and adjusted my hiking poles, the familiar weight of my gear, a small comfort in the growing darkness. At 47, I was no stranger to the solitude of the woods, but tonight felt different. Maybe it was the silence, so complete it seemed to press against my ears. Or maybe it was the way the trees seemed to lean in closer, their gnarled branches like skeletal fingers reaching out to snag my jacket. I had chosen this trail on a whim, a last-minute decision to escape the monotony of my life. Middle-aged, no kids, no pets, just a quiet house filled with the ghosts of aspirations I never quite realized. I used to dream of hosting dinner parties, filling my home with laughter and the clink of glasses. But the truth was, I hadn't entertained in years. The TV in the living room, a relic of my love for classic horror movies, gathered dust. These days, I spent more time with a bottle of bourbon than with people. It wasn't a problem, not really. Just a habit, a way to quiet the thoughts that buzzed like flies in my head. The trail ahead was narrow, barely visible in the dim light. I clicked on my headlamp, the beam cutting through the gloom. The forest was eerily still, the usual sounds of rustling leaves and distant bird calls absent. It was as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something. I shook off the feeling, chalking it up to my overactive imagination. Too many late nights watching The Shining and The Thing had left me prone to seeing monsters in the shadows. But as I walked, the unease grew. The trees seemed to close in around me, their trunks twisting into grotesque shapes. The beam of my headlamp caught something on the ground, a pair of hiking boots, scuffed and worn, lying abandoned in the middle of the trail. I stopped, my heart pounding. They were my size, the laces neatly tied. I crouched down, reaching out to touch them, but pulled back at the last second. Something about them felt wrong, like they didn't belong here, like they were waiting for me. I stood up, forcing myself to keep moving. The boots were probably just lost by some hiker, nothing to worry about. But the thought nagged at me, a splinter in my mind. Why would someone leave their boots behind? And why here, in the middle of nowhere? The trail began to climb, the incline steep and unforgiving. My legs burned with the effort, and my breath came in ragged gasps. The forest seemed to grow darker with every step, the trees pressing in closer. I could hear something now, a faint whispering that seemed to come from all around me. It was soft, almost melodic, but there was an edge to it that made my skin crawl. I stopped, turning in a slow circle, trying to pinpoint the source. But the sound was everywhere and nowhere, slipping through the trees like a ghost. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. The whispering stopped, replaced by a silence so deep it felt like a physical presence. I stood there, my heart pounding, waiting for something to happen. But the forest remained still, the trees watching me with their silent, ancient eyes. I forced myself to keep moving, my steps quick and uneven. The trail twisted and turned, the trees growing denser, their branches tangling together overhead. The beam of my headlamp flickered, the battery dying. I cursed under my breath, slapping the side of the lamp. The light steadied, but only for a moment before flickering again. I was losing daylight fast, and the thought of being stranded in the woods with a dead headlamp sent a chill down my spine. The whispering started again, louder this time. It was a language I didn't understand, the words guttural and harsh. I could feel them in my chest, vibrating through my bones. I picked up the pace, my boots crunching on the dry leaves. The trail was disappearing, the undergrowth thickening. I was lost, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. I had no idea where I was or how to get back. The whispering grew louder, more insistent. I could feel it pulling at me, drawing me deeper into the woods. My headlamp flickered again, the beam dimming to a faint glow. I stumbled, my foot catching on a root. I fell hard, the impact knocking the breath from my lungs. I lay there for a moment, dazed, the forest spinning around me. When I opened my eyes, the headlamp was dead, the darkness closing in. I fumbled in my pocket for my phone, my hands shaking. The screen lit up, the battery at 10%. No signal, of course. I cursed again, the sound swallowed by the trees. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs trembling. The whispering was louder now, almost deafening. I could feel it in my head, a pressure building behind my eyes. I started to run, my boots slipping on the wet leaves. The trees seemed to reach out for me, their branches clawing at my jacket. I could feel something behind me, something huge and ancient, its breath hot on my neck. I burst into a clearing, the moon casting a pale light over the ground. In the center of the clearing was a cabin, its windows dark and empty. The sight of it filled me with a strange mix of relief and dread. I hesitated, the whispering growing louder, more urgent. I could feel it pulling at me, drawing me toward the cabin. I took a step forward, then another, my legs moving on their own. The door creaked open as I approached, the sound sending a shiver down my spine. Inside, the cabin was cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of rot. The walls were covered in strange symbols, carved deep into the wood. The floor was littered with bones, their surfaces smooth and yellowed with age. In the center of the room was a chair, its back to me. I could see the outline of someone sitting in it, their head tilted to one side. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't move. I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispering had stopped, replaced by a silence so deep it felt like a physical presence. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the back of the chair. It spun around, the figure's face coming into view. I stumbled back, a scream caught in my throat. The figure was me, my own face staring back at me with empty, lifeless eyes. Its mouth opened, a low, guttural sound escaping its lips. I turned and ran, the cabin door slamming shut behind me. I didn't stop running until I reached the trailhead, my lungs burning and my legs shaking. The forest was silent now, the whispering gone. I collapsed onto the ground, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. I didn't know what I had seen in that cabin, but I knew I would never forget it. The next morning, I woke up in my own bed, the sun streaming through the windows. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream, a nightmare brought on by too much bourbon and too many horror movies. But then, I saw them, sitting by the door, neatly tied and waiting for me. My hiking boots, scuffed and worn, just like the ones I had seen on the trail. Clark had always found peace in the wilderness. The way the trees whispered in the wind, the way the earth felt solid beneath his boots. It was as if the world was alive, breathing with him. That's why he had chosen Black Hollow Trail, a 1,600-mile stretch of untouched forest. At 42, with dark hair and a mustache that had seen better days, Clark was no stranger to solitude. He had been practicing Eastern spirituality for years, and this hike was supposed to be a journey inward, a chance to reconnect with himself. But something about this forest felt wrong. It started with the symbols. Clark noticed them carved into tree trunks, crude and jagged, as if they'd been made in a hurry. Then there were the herbs, bundles of dried plants hanging from branches, swaying in the breeze like tiny sinister wind chimes. He told himself it was nothing, maybe some local ritual or the work of a quirky hiker. But the deeper he went, the heavier the air felt, like the forest itself was holding its breath. By the time he made camp on the third night, Clark was on edge. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the shadows stretched long and thin across the clearing. He built a small fire and sat cross-legged, trying to meditate, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. His hand kept drifting to the axe on his pack, a tool for chopping wood, sure, but also his only weapon out here. That's when he heard it. A low, guttural growl, just beyond the firelight. Clark's eyes snapped open, and he grabbed the axe, standing slowly. The growl came again, closer this time, and he saw movement in the shadows. A figure stepped into the edge of the clearing, tall, broad-shouldered, and carrying an axe of his own. His face was hidden in the darkness, but Clark could feel his eyes on him, cold and unblinking. "Who are you?" Clark called, his voice trembling despite his best efforts. The man didn't answer. He just tilted his head, as if studying Clark, and took a step forward. Clark's grip tightened on the axe. "Stay back!" The figure stopped, but the silence was worse than any words. Clark's mind raced. He thought of the duffel bag he'd seen earlier that day, partially buried under leaves. He hadn't opened it. Something about it felt off, but now he wished he had. What if it held something terrible? What if this man had something to do with it? The figure took another step, and Clark swung his axe, forcing him back into the shadows. But as soon as he did, the growling started again, this time from all around him. Clark spun in a circle, his axe at the ready, but the darkness seemed alive, pressing in on him from every side. The fire flickered, casting twisted shadows that danced like specters. And then he heard it, a voice, low and rasping, like dry leaves scraping against stone. "You shouldn't have come here." Clark turned, but it was too late. The man was already on him, his axe raised high. Clark barely had time to block the blow, the impact reverberating through his arms. They struggled, their faces inches apart, and Clark caught a glimpse of the man's eyes, dark and empty, like two bottomless pits. With a surge of strength, Clark pushed him back and swung again, striking his shoulder. The man howled, a sound that was almost inhuman, and retreated into the trees. Clark stood there, breathing heavily, his axe dripping with blood. The forest was silent again, but he knew the man would be back. He quickly doused the fire, scattering the embers and stamping out every last spark. He couldn't risk leaving a trace. Packing up his camp in a frenzy, he slung his pack over his shoulders and started down the trail at a run. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get away. Hours later, exhausted and disoriented, Clark stumbled upon a cabin. It was old and weathered, with a sagging roof and broken windows, but it was shelter. He pushed open the door, the hinges creaking loudly, and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and the smell of mildew. In the corner of the room, he saw it, a duffel bag, identical to the one he'd seen earlier. His stomach churned as he approached it, his hands trembling as he unzipped it. Inside was a collection of items that made his blood run cold. A hunting knife, a coil of rope, a blood-stained flannel shirt, and a Polaroid photograph of a woman with her face crossed out in red marker. Clark's breath hitched as he dug deeper, his fingers brushing against something wrapped in plastic. He pulled it out and immediately dropped it, his heart pounding. It was a human hand, pale and lifeless, the nails chipped and dirty. Clark staggered back, his mind racing. He had to get out of there. He turned toward the door, but before he could take a step, he heard it, the growl, low and guttural, right outside the cabin. The door slammed shut with a force that made the walls shudder. Clark spun around, his axe raised, but the room was empty. The growl came again, this time from inside the cabin, and he realized with a sinking feeling that he wasn't alone. He didn't wait to see what would happen next. With a burst of adrenaline, he hurled himself at the nearest window, crashing through the rotted wood and glass. He hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of him, but he forced himself to his feet and ran. He didn't look back, didn't stop, even as the growls echoed behind him, growing fainter with every step. When he finally emerged from the forest hours later, battered and bleeding, he collapsed onto the side of a dirt road. A passing ranger found him and called for help. Clark tried to explain what had happened, but his story came out in fragments. The symbols, the man with the axe, the duffel bag, the hand. The rangers searched the area but found nothing. No cabin, no bag, no footprints. Just an empty stretch of woods, silent and still. Clark never went back to Black Hollow Trail. He couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching him, waiting for him to return. And sometimes, late at night, he'd wake up to the sound of a low guttural growl just outside his window. Dylan had always prided himself on being an experienced hiker. Trails that made others nervous were where he felt most at home. So when he heard about the abandoned Ridgeway Trail, he couldn't resist. The trail had been closed for nearly 2 decades, but whispers of its strange history intrigued him. Hikers disappearing, eerie sounds, and shadowy figures spotted between the trees. Urban legends, he thought. Nothing more. The sun dipped below the tree line as he stepped onto the overgrown path. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of damp leaves. His boots crunched against the soft dirt as he moved forward, his flashlight secured to his backpack strap in case darkness overtook him. The first mile was uneventful, just a normal hike through thick woods. But as he reached an old wooden bridge crossing a dried-out creek, an unsettling feeling crawled up his spine. The woods had gone eerily silent. No chirping insects, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive stillness pressing in on him. Then he heard it. Footsteps, not his own. They were light, deliberate, and just a few paces behind him. Dylan turned sharply, shining his flashlight through the dense forest. Nothing. The beam of light revealed only twisted tree trunks and shifting shadows. He let out a shaky breath and pushed forward, telling himself it was just paranoia. But the footsteps followed. They would stop when he stopped, move when he moved, always staying just far enough behind that he couldn't quite see who or what was there. Dylan's pulse quickened. He was alone out here, or at least he should have been. Deciding to test his theory, he took 3 quick steps forward, then stopped abruptly. The echoing steps faltered, as if whatever was mimicking him hadn't expected him to change pace. A low whisper drifted through the trees. It was distant, indistinct, but it sent a chill crawling over Dylan's skin. He wasn't imagining this. Something was out here with him. He picked up his pace, trying to shake the heavy feeling of being watched. As he ascended a steep incline, he saw something ahead. An old wooden sign, half-rotten and leaning to one side. The lettering was barely legible in the dim light, but he could make out the words, "Turn back." Dylan scoffed. He had come too far to turn around now. Then the whisper came again, closer this time. "Leave." Dylan's breath hitched. The voice was neither male nor female, just a soft, raspy murmur carried on the wind. His instincts screamed at him to run, but he forced himself to keep walking. He was nearing the summit when he caught movement in the corner of his eye. Something darted between the trees, a shadowy figure, humanoid but impossibly tall, its limbs too long and thin. His flashlight flickered as he swung it toward the figure, but it was gone. Dylan's hands shook. The stories weren't just stories. He turned, ready to abandon the trail, but the path behind him was different. The way he had come was now choked with dense foliage that hadn't been there before. The trees stood unnaturally close together, forming a wall of gnarled bark and tangled branches. Panic gripped his chest. He was trapped. A rustling sound came from above. Dylan tilted his head, his flashlight beam catching something shifting in the trees. A face, pale, hollow-eyed, peering down at him from the canopy. Then, with unnatural speed, it moved. Dylan ran. His legs pumped as he tore through the underbrush, ignoring the sting of branches scraping his arms. The footsteps behind him grew louder, faster, no longer mimicking him but chasing him. The summit had to be close. If he could reach the open clearing, maybe. A root caught his foot, and he went down hard, his breath leaving him in a sharp gasp. The flashlight rolled out of reach, casting eerie shadows against the trees. Then he felt it, cold fingers grazing his ankle. Dylan screamed, kicking wildly as he scrambled forward. He grabbed the flashlight, turned it toward his attacker, and saw nothing. No hands, no figure. Just empty forest. Terror clawed at his mind. He pushed himself up and ran, his only focus on escaping this nightmare. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the forest opened up. He stumbled into a clearing, gasping for breath. The moon cast silver light over the grass, and in the center stood an old, crumbling cabin. The front door was ajar, revealing nothing but darkness within. Behind him, the footsteps stopped at the tree line. He turned, heart hammering, but the forest was still once more. The oppressive silence had returned. Something didn't want to cross into the clearing. Dylan hesitated only a moment before stepping inside the cabin. The air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. His flashlight flickered as he swept it across the room. Broken furniture, shattered glass, and deep gouges in the wooden floorboards, like something had been dragged. A sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut behind him. And then in the darkness, the whisper returned. Right next to his ear. Too late. Dylan never made it off the Ridgeway Trail. Hikers still speak of him in hushed tones, of the lone flashlight found at the summit, its battery drained, of the eerie whispers that follow those who venture too far, and of the echoing footsteps that still sound in the dead of night. And that concludes this week's chilling journey into the unknown. We hope these tales have left you looking over your shoulder and questioning the darkness around you. Craving more horror? Subscribe to our YouTube channel for even more terrifying tales. Until next time, remember, there are always more nightmares waiting to be told.